Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with Henry Hill, the deputy editor of Conservative Home, and the journalist and author Christina Patterson. So let's take a quick look at what is on some of those front pages. Well, the Mail on Sunday leads with a warning from Rishi Sunak, who is urging voters not to give Labour a blank cheque for tax hikes and an amnesty for illegal migrants. The Sunday Express also leads on the Prime Minister and has claimed that Labour would cause irreversible damage in its first 100 days in power. That's on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph too, Mr Sunak warning that Labour would bankrupt every generation. The Observer, meanwhile, leads with Sir Keir Starmer's promise to voters. He says he will relight the fire of optimism. The Sunday Mirror's front cover urges its readers to vote Labour. The Sunday Times says Labour will review Greenbelt rules to build more houses if elected. And the Daily Star on Sunday leads on England's chances in the Euros. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code that you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us. And we are joined in the studio tonight by Henry Hill and Christina Patterson. Thank you both so much for being us. I guess the first batch of Sunday papers before the election. Let's look at the Observer and the headline there. Starmer's promise to voters will relight the fire of optimism. And we were having a chat before coming on air, and we were mentioning, Christina, weren't we, that perhaps optimism isn't something that there is a lot of around right now. So what do you make of this headline?
Well, I think he's been told that nobody's the least bit excited or inspired by him, and therefore, in the last run-up, he needs to inject a little note of optimism, and therefore he has dutifully injected a note of optimism. But actually what he's done is really just inject the word optimism into this speech, because it's not very evident what it's about. But one thing in this piece that I agree with, he has essentially said that the Labour Party, hope to restore some trust in politics and politicians and some integrity. And I think I'm probably one of millions of people in this country who thinks even if Labour can't do very much after the election, and of course they will make some changes, but they will be working in very constrained circumstances, I think the relief that we do not have a bunch of liars and charlatans in charge, as we have since... I was going to say I wouldn't call Rishi Sunak a liar, although I do think, actually, that the 2000 tax claim that he has been repeating is actually a lie, and even the very cautious Keir Starmer called it a lie during one of the election debates. But beyond that, when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, the whole landscape of politics changed, and he is known to be a pathological and serial liar, and he just brought lie after lie into the public arena, and that wrecked our international reputation and destroyed the trust of so many people. That was even before Partygate. So I do think that on that point alone, I think there will be a sense of relief and a sense of optimism that some things can be better. Henry?
I mean, I think if there's one thing that Rishi Sunak has demonstrated, it's that not being Boris Johnson is not enough to win you the enduring love of the British people. Starmer is right. The Labour are going to inherit one of the most difficult in-trays that any government has had since World War II, right? It's going to be extraordinarily difficult for them. And I think the problem that Starmer has is, yes, he's going to win a big majority by all accounts, but that isn't on much enthusiasm for any kind of positive programme, because Labour has a very limited programme. And the danger for that is that then when things get difficult, when that initial honeymoon period has worn off, what happens to that government? Because if he's run on a narrow manifesto, his MPs won't be committed. If he and Rachel Reeves decide 2 years in that actually they need to make some quite controversial decisions, and the MPs haven't committed to that at the election, that large majority might become quite difficult to manage. And of course, for Tony Blair, the last great Labour leader who won a landslide, he inherited a growing economy and low taxes. So there was plenty of scope there for cultivating a feeling of optimism and spreading the money around. Starmer won't have that. So I think I agree with Christina. He's using the word because he knows he needs to, but there's a reason that the public aren't optimistic, and it's because there's no grounds for it in this election.
Let's take a look at the Telegraph front page there. Not their main story. Second, Reeves, UK will be haven amid EU populism. Rachel Reeves, of course, who could be the country's first female chancellor very soon. And she's talking about business specifically. Henry, back to you on this first, please.
Yeah, so this is basically contrasting the situation in the United Kingdom with what we see happening in Europe, specifically, I think, France, where we see the far right in the form of Rassemblement National potentially about to become the largest party in the French Parliament. You've got the rise of AfD in Germany, Fratelli d'Italia in Italy, a post-fascist origin party are the governing party there. And by contrast, the United Kingdom is going to have a social democratic government with a stonking majority. And so from the perspective of business investment, and Rachel Reeves, her priority, she hasn't used per capita GDP, but she uses the phrase, she uses living standards a lot. She wants to boost living standards. She wants to, Labour's whole plan is to get economic growth going again. And so the hope is that actually, compared to some of those other countries, the United Kingdom, remarkably, given the last few years, actually starts to look like a fairly safe place to put your money.
What do you think?
Well, I agree with that. And I mean, it's simply a statement of fact that business leaders are, the vast majority of them seem to be supporting Labour at this election, but then almost nobody is supporting the Tories, and particularly after Brexit and the damage that has done to business. But it's also just a fact that what's happening in Europe is very worrying. I mean, it's already happened in Italy, and the situation in France is very worrying, and also worrying for the global markets, because we know what happens when extreme things happen. And, you know, I think the last thing we all need is more global turbulence at the moment. But I think we will become a kind of good bet relative to many countries in Europe. And I think, you know, that will be a very welcome change, particularly after Brexit.
It'll be interesting to see how the dynamics change with us and Europe. Let's go to the Sunday Times. And a story here, Labour eyes up green belt for building blitz. Obviously, the housing crisis is a massive issue here. And here it says Starmer plans to overhaul within days if elected. Henry.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that this is a Labour story by the looks of it rather than a Tory story, because one of the things the Conservatives have tried to go at Labour on is that Labour are talking up their plans to overhaul the green belt, which the Tories have found spooks an awful lot of voters in so-called blue wall suburban and home county seats. Starmer is saying that he is going to reimpose mandatory housing targets on councils in order to try and get house building up, and he has plans to start redesignating ugly bits of the green belt as what he calls the grey belt. And Labour clearly feel sufficiently confident of their lead that they're actually leaning into this story, which is important because it means that they will have a mandate to make these decisions. And even, I think one of the interesting dynamics in this next parliament is going to be if they've suddenly got a load of Labour MPs representing the true blue shires and places they never expected to win, those MPs might start trying to block this stuff. So it's good that they're getting that in now.
What have you made of this story, Christina?
Well, I think they have to build houses, and the only way to do that is, you know, you can't just build them in the middle of nowhere. They have to be in places where people work and can commute to. So I think, you know, they have said they will, and he's just kind of essentially reassuring us that they will get on with what they've said they're going to do. And they're also going to slash the MP summer recess, which I think is very welcome news, because I think most people think, why on earth are MPs on holiday for so long when there's so much urgent stuff to be done? So basically, this is him rolling up his sleeves, metaphorically, to say, we mean business and we're going to get going with it. But needless to say, he's used the usual quota of politicians' cliches. So, you know, hit the ground running, turbocharge, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, there we are. You don't have to be particularly eloquent. You just have to do what you say you're going to do.
Well, speaking of eloquence, let's look at the Mail on Sunday front page there. Quite a headline. Rishi warning Starmer will wreck Britain in just 100 days. What have you made of the tone of this, Henry?
I mean, it's clearly an attempt to mobilise the Conservative core vote, because the voters the Conservatives are targeting now are disaffected Conservatives, capital C, who are the kind of voters who won't vote for someone else, but may not turn out to vote for the Conservatives because they're so scuppered with the government. And this is very much about trying to get those voters to go to the polls, because with the state of where the polls are, even in seats where the Tories have massive majorities, it could come down to a very close thing. And so keeping that turnout up is what's important. The problem for Sunak is that net immigration has tripled from 2010 to 2014. Taxes are at their highest level since 1948. These tunes are really hard for the Tories to play, given their record.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the Mail and the Telegraph are kind of clinging on for dear life to a kind of pro-Tory message, and an increasingly desperate pro-Tory message, because the voters just aren't buying it, and the polls reflect that. And I do think and I say this sadly as a journalist, that it does show the diminishing influence of newspapers because, people will not be told what to believe in the way that they used to. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how the Mail and the Telegraph respond when there is a Labour government.
We'll see if and when. Henry and Christina, thank you so much. Stay with us. Coming up, among the stories that we will be discussing next, this on the front of the Sunday Times, and the UK's most senior civil servant is set to step down. We'll be right back.
I'm David Blevins, and I'm Sky's senior Ireland correspondent. I'm based in Belfast, a city transformed by peace, but still struggling with its past. Politically, the two sides are as far apart as ever, and it's over that question of who has sovereignty in Northern Ireland, the very issue that's been the source of tension here for generations. It takes 60 minutes to cross the Irish Sea. It took the British monarchy a century. I've spent 25 years reporting the journey from conflict to peace.
The political parties of Northern Ireland have reached agreement.
We help you understand the world with us.
Today, we have reached an agreement with the Conservative Party on support for government in Parliament.
We already know what the government gets out of this deal. What exactly does the DUP get out of it? Well, £1.5 billion. Welcome to Winterfell. It's an iconic location in this globally acclaimed drama. Ophelia was the most powerful hurricane this far east in the Atlantic on record. You can't live in a place like this and not appreciate the environment.
Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me now, Henry Hill and Christina Patterson. OK, let's go straight to the front page of the Sunday Telegraph and taking a break from our own election and looking at America's. Jill Biden takes flack for urging the president on. Obviously, President Biden did not have a good debate on Thursday, and then we saw that clip of his wife, I suppose, urging him on and saying he'd answered all the questions, and now there's a lot of pressure on him to stand down. The New York Times has published an editorial. Christina, what do you make of it?
Well, I mean, it was absolutely excruciating. I, as it happens, was having a sleepless night that night, and I looked at Twitter and I just couldn't bear it. I just couldn't bear it.
Never look at Twitter if you're having a sleepless night, Christina.
Well, just seeing, I mean, it was just unbearable. And this will sound extreme, but I think this is really, really serious. And I think if Biden doesn't stand down, that is almost Putin-esque levels of amorality or even immorality, because he is so clearly unelectable now. And, the difference between him and 4 years. 4 years ago, I was celebrating his victory. It felt like a moment of blessed relief and release for America. And he still had the sense of the fiery person he was, eloquent, reasonably good at debating and so on. And now he is a shell of himself. And I think he should have the gumption to stand down. But for Jill Biden to speak to him as if he's some primary school kid saying, well done, you answered all the questions, excruciating.
Because then the difference with the US is that whereas here we can kind of kick our leaders out, there he has to himself say he's not going to run.
Yes, I think that is the case, because they have this quite arcane delegate system, but I think they're all pledged. So he would actually have to release his delegates if they wanted to have someone else at the convention. And it's just absolutely extraordinary, because this story has been building up for a year or two, and originally it was sort of dismissed as Republican smears and the use of selective clips. But it is quite clear that he, and all of the stuff that's coming up behind the scenes about how tired he is.
Yeah.
I was watching a clip just now where he said that after he was elected in 2020, he went to a G7 summit in Europe and he had a conversation with Mitterrand, who famously died in 1996. So it's criminally irresponsible. And I think that actually what's fascinating is the gulf between the rhetoric from many of the Democrats around the utter unacceptability of Donald Trump and the imperative of keeping him out of the White House, and the self-indulgence of keeping Joe Biden as a candidate, because they had time to get rid of him before this. They have waited this long.
Yeah, but it's complicity. I mean, I think it's really serious. It's not even self-indulgence. It is complicity, because if Trump becomes president, which looks at the moment like the most likely scenario, that is really worrying. He has literally said he will not respect. He clearly, what happened on the 6th of January was criminal, and it would be a terrible thing in history if he became president again.
OK, let's go to The Times now, back to our election. Front page of The Times, changing of the guard for our top mandarins. Henry, what's the story about?
Yeah, so this is a slightly inside baseball story, if you're not that into politics, but it is important. So Simon Case, who is the head of the civil service, is standing down, and that means that Starmer and Sue Gray, his chief of staff, who was a former Mandarin herself in a previous life, are going to get to have somebody completely new at the top of the civil service to work with. And Simon Case has been involved in some of the stories around Partygate and Boris Johnson, and so I think it will help Starmer with the sense of a changing of the guard. It might help to reset relations between politicians and the civil service, which have got quite strained recently under the Conservatives. So it's going to be really interesting to see who they pick, because most people will never hear of the new person because they don't tend to appear in the newspapers if things are going well. But to Simon Case and his successor, they are very, very important to the machinery of government.
Christina?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, look, it just seemed to me that Simon Case really didn't cover himself in glory during COVID and seemed to be complicit in Partygate. So he has said differently in testifying in the COVID inquiry, but I'm afraid, I think he became the story, which you shouldn't if you're a civil servant. So I think it will be a good opportunity to get somebody new in charge of the civil service.
Christina, Henry, we're going to have to leave it there, but we'll have a look at more of the Sunday papers at 11:30. So see you then. Coming up next on Sky News at 11, Reform UK goes on the offensive, accusing the media of a stitch-up after a campaigner was recorded using a racial slur to describe Rishi Sunak.